statute speaking specifically about parks as having one of the primary roles being a tourist attraction for public engagement, and that you're not talking about wildlife sanctuaries or nature reserves. Also, you have a lot of freedom in giving a mechanism. Mechanisms are basically your process or how you're basically going to implement your policy. So you have a latitude in giving mechanisms by which you're going to do your policy. This might mean in the House with ban zoos motion, you could say you're going to shut down all existing zoos and move all their animals to wildlife reserves that are not open to the public, and that you will like prohibit opening of new zoos, and punish with fines or imprisonments any attempts to. This is basically a policy saying that you're banning zoos and you don't want to have any zoos in the world. But different motions call for complicated mechanisms. But when you're giving a mechanism or your definition of the debate, it shouldn't be debate breaking. This means that you have to set up something that creates a debate other than making your debate obviously one-sided. And if you do this and you make the debate unfair to the other side, your opposition side, this is called narrowing, and you will be penalized by your judges. Um, in opening government, you have your prime minister and your deputy prime minister, right? Prime minister has the duty to include defining specific terms in the motion and advocating for a specific policy or specific policy changes, and articulating the roles of the relevant stakeholders of the motion. They need to establish that a problem exists, and usually when motions are created, it's because there is a problem that needs to be dealt with. So Prime Minister does this by establishing that a problem does exist and it needs to be dealt with very, very fast. And it provides reasons. It's if you have to, you can also kind of outline related to the value of zoos, but is also distinct from the material that was brought up in the opening half, that it would constitute as an extension and not just a summary of your openings case, right? The second speaker of the closing half is called the whip speaker, and they are the only speakers in a debate that can't bring in any new material. This means that if they come up with any new analysis during their speeches, the judges can't credit them for that. So their job is to basically sum up the debate, and honestly, it's kind of like giving oral adjudication, but it's biased oral adjudication. So you want to emphasize the contributions that were made by your partner and show why they beat everything else that was said in the debate. You need to show why your ideas clash into those of your oppositions, and you need to show why your contributions are also distinct and more important than those given by your own opening teams, right? So, again, with the example of this household ban Zeus, CEO would show us why their material is the most important, about how this money is without the money of without the money and keeping the zoos open, then we can't get what opening introduced, which is the educational resources and helping endangered species stay alive. So you basically need to show us why your case is more important and why, as a judges, we should take yeah. So member of government has to address any new contributions made by deputy leader of opposition and engage in a holistic rebuttal of opening opposition and even preempt what CO is likely to claim, right? They need to add something new to the debate, and you might choose to present an entirely new argument, or you might choose to develop an important argument that you're opening. You need to avoid contradicting opening government's case, and adding is important to opening government's case, right? The government whip should kind of identify two or three of the most important concepts of the debates, and these concepts are going to be the main points of government whip speech, right? And they need to explain why, as closing government, their conceptual breakdown is the best way to view the debate. They need to you guys need to sell the extension of closing government. You need to show how the other team's material relates to other important content, how your team's material relates to other important content in the debate, and show us why your position defeats the most important arguments presented by the opposition, right? You need to rebut the contributions made by the member of opposition and basically rebut in a holistic way, right? The member of opposition needs to answer the new material presented by the member of government and engage in a holistic rebuttal of the whole proposition bench. So you need to rebut against opening government and you need to rebut against closing government. You need to look for and exploit the contradictions between opening government and closing government. You need to add new things that are unique and distinct from your, I guess, develop your openings arguments. You need to show that are attacked by people are usually large companies and not small ones with the history of continued environmental degradation, right? This means that because small companies don't degrade the environment at large scales, then we're only supporting violent tactics by these environmental movements if they're um, attacking big corporations because they're the only ones with a large carbon footprint that are degrading the environment at a larger scale, right? But um, this framing doesn't really do a lot of things. It allows you to push ideas that big companies intentionally choose not to allocate significant portions of their profit towards development of green tech companies. Another possible upframing is that eco-terrorism is a last resort, and these environmental movements have tried so many things that weren't successful, and this basically allows you to talk about morality in a greater detail and basically talk about at what point does an action become moral, right? In both frames, up would have limited the amount of discussion that can come from the government side, right? This makes the debate more difficult for government because in order for them to run their material, they need to spend a significant amount of time challenging opposition's framing. In instances where government fails to engage, opposition is, I guess, kind of almost guaranteed a win. But in cases where proposition engages and opposition remains relevant, they only need to prove their frame, right? In a motion that says this House believes that parents should actively instill the value of questioning authority in their children, a lot of arguments can flow from both sides, honestly. Opening up, opening Gov could essentially say you have two burdens, right? First, you need to prove that principally most authority is illegitimate, and so questioning or disobeying is the morally correct thing to do, right? Secondly, is to show that teaching children to disobey authority was result in those children being less likely to join in on things that hurt other children, like bullying, right? Here, you kind of set yourself low burdens, right? It's quite easy to show that these kinds of authority are not earned, but they're merely given by default, right? You talk about why children are more likely to disobey the most illegitimate kinds of authority, which they will recognize as having no basis in reality, and are likely to continue to listen to like doctors or lawyers, I guess, who can prove their credentials as legitimate authorities, right? You can also talk about children as being children and rather spending too much time on the long term when those children become adults, right? The way to make this seem plausible is through more framing. You say that there's a vast gap between the kinds of values which we teach children and the kinds of values that they actually end up acting upon as adults. When we teach children the value of respect, that doesn't necessarily mean that they grow up to respect everyone all the time, even though we wish that they did, right? And it becomes a set of traits which balances out with other traits. So with authority, we say that it's likely that they grow up with a healthy disrespect of authority, but that the most important impacts happen when they are children because children have a quite black and white moral framework, which means that if you actively instill one, they're likely to take it more strongly, I guess. Uh, Another thing in framing that moral or resolutions are social issues and solutions that ultimately affect different people differently, I guess. Nearly every debate will have groups who are winners and obviously groups who are losers. So in such cases, you are going to identify a stakeholder, right? And it's very important to show why your stakeholder is important to the debate so you can, I guess, inflate its impact as large as possible, right? Framing the importance of groups can be either through telling the panel that the sheer number of this group makes it an urgent one, makes its issue an urgent one, or that these are humans who deserve their cases to be prioritized, right? So, because we care more about groups that can't protect themselves or have been subject to injustices, whether these injustices have been present or historical, or people that are otherwise dependent upon the state, right? So if you kind of run through a framing of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of one, right? So you are defending many and you tell the panel that it's important for us to protect the people that have been previously disadvantaged, if it's black people, then you talk about how black people haven't always had the advantage um, in our current world, right? But if you're talking about your oppositions, you need to minimize their harm or as important as your impact, right? So you also want to talk about their qualities, about how they have bad qualities, and how anything that is done to them is not going to be as important as what's going to be done on your side, right? So groups who are broadly well off, so like wealthy, I guess white people, for example, or people that are able to look after themselves are seen as less important in debates more than marginalized individuals. So you want to paint a grim and urgent picture of the group that you want to help, right? And these form of descriptions instill a sense of urgency that justifies your implementation of a certain policy, right? So we also have moral frameworks, right? So moral frameworks are kind of schools of thought where people see whether certain actions are ethical or not. And debaters kind of have a difficult time in engaging competing morals. Debaters tend to focus exclusively on consequence. And you can frame a debate and arguments in a way that is not contingent on consequences and outcomes. So, for example, example of a purely consequentialist argument is if you are debating against torturing a person, the opposition could come up and say, why shouldn't we torture someone whose information could save thousands or even millions of people if, or why shouldn't we torture people if that information that they can give us could be vital in dismantling terrorism, right? So um, some ethics kind of focus on how actions follow certain moral rules, right? So the action is judged rather on the consequence of the action, and the biggest thing kinda is is this rule of how if you were to universalize the opposite, would the world be livable? So if we were to universalize, if we weren't rather to universalize the do not steal rule, would our world be livable? I don't think so. Because if everyone stole, then there wouldn't be any concept of private property. So, in the torturing a terrorist question, you may want to say that the motion is about human rights and ethics, and that regardless of whether a person is a terrorist or not, they deserve to be treated with human dignity. And you want to say that preserving his dignity is the right thing to do because wars against terror are essentially to preserve human dignity, and that violating his dignity is equal to, I guess, consenting that we ourselves do not deserve dignity, right? So you can show that um, utilitarianism often clashes with our moral institutions on a deep level. So this means basically that we shouldn't trust that one way is the only way in which we can judge whether something is morally correct or not. So, for example, would it be a reasonable thing to remove the organs of one person in a hospital waiting room to save the lives of other people, of five other people? So we don't do that, obviously, for obvious reasons, but we want to talk about the actors involved in this debate, specifically the person we were torturing and the person doing the torturing, right? You could start by analyzing why it might be bad to instrumentalize a human being and treating them as a means to an end rather than an end to themselves, right? You can say we think that everyone deserves a basic level of human dignity, and even those that commit the worst crimes, we would only allow state sanctioned violence against those people when those people themselves are a threat rather than in order to obtain some kind of an end like information. So you could talk about the kind of state that makes someone into a torturer is not one that we particularly want to live under, right? And how this in itself is a form of instrumentalization, and why we have a moral imperative to not want to be that kind of state, right? And so once you've done that, you can then move on to your consequence arguments and of how this kind of creates sympathy, social sympathy that inspires terrorists because people are going to be outraged that why are you torturing people, or how this kind of sends a precedent. So some ethics kind of are too absolute, right? And some moral frameworks argue that certain actions are always good or they're always bad. And this kind of doesn't take into context of the premise. So you can, as opposition, you can describe how a particular situation necessitates a violation of actions, right? You can give an example of how some rights, well, most rights aren't absolute, and how we limit them when it comes to, I guess, saving people's lives, right? So it's sometimes important to show that even if, so when you're opposing to this on how certain situations necessitates a violation of rights or ethics, you can tell the panel that even if these rights can be limited in certain conditions, this specific situation that we're in isn't one of those conditions that necessitates a violation of rights. That we have other alternatives that can be done, and how it's an illegitimate reason to kind of limit rights or violate ethics, right? But framing isn't just about a debate at large, it's also about an argument. So you don't necessarily have to frame an entire debate. You can also just frame a specific argument. And you do this by presenting a claim, explaining what your claim looks like, telling us why your specific claim is true and why it is important on a comparative level. So why your specific claim is more important, why preserving the rights of terrorists or the dignity of terrorists is more important than saving the lives of a million other people in the state or whatever. Yeah. So if you guys have any questions, you can ask me on the chat box. If there aren't any questions, then I think I am done. Important to show us why your frame, specifically your team's frame, is more important and is more true than your opposing side's frame. That way, the panel can buy into it, I guess. I don't know if I've answered your question. Sorry, can someone please clarify on what they mean by possible penalties for Prime Minister? Okay, so um if I'm understanding your question clearly, you're asking me what, as for example, OG, I should say OO must argue in terms of my framing. I think, yeah, it's important. So, like I said, you, as you go up, you present your framing and you tell us why or what the debate isn't about and what the debate is about. So when you're saying that, you're basically kind of telling what the other side should argue in terms of your framing and what is outside of your framework and what the opposition kind of shouldn't be arguing or shouldn't be saying in this debate. Okay, I think I've answered you guys. If anyone else has any more questions, you guys are free to ask.